In the spring of 1462, as the armies of the Ottoman Empire crossed the Danube and pushed deep into the territory of Wallachia, the soldiers expected battle. What they did not expect was silence, no war drums, no cavalry charge, no fortified walls lined with defenders, only darkness. Then, at dawn, the fog lifted. Before them stretched a nightmare made real. More than 20,000 human bodies stood impaled on wooden stakes, arranged in perfect rows across the plains outside the Wallachian capital of Targovite. Men, women, children, Turkish soldiers, local criminals, political enemies, all rotting in the open air. Birds circled overhead. The stench was unbearable. Even hardened veterans turned away in horror. At the front of the Ottoman host stood Mehmed II, conqueror of Constantinople, one of the most feared rulers on earth. He had marched into Wallachia confident of swift victory. What he found instead was psychological annihilation. According to multiple contemporary chroniclers, the Sultan stared at the field in stunned silence, then spoke words that would echo through history. A man who could do this to his own people could not be ruled. This was the ultimate weapon of the Wallachian ruler later known to the world as Vlad the Impaler. Not the sword, not the fortress, not the army, terror itself. This moment in 1462 would define his legend forever. But to understand how a man could turn fear into a governing system, a battlefield strategy, and a personal philosophy, we must return to his beginning, not in triumph, but in captivity. Vlad was born in 1431 in the city of Sayora, located in the mountainous region of Transylvania. His father, Vlad II Dracula, was a minor ruler struggling to survive between two crushing powers, the expanding Ottoman Empire to the south and the Kingdom of Hungary to the west. His father's loyalty shifted repeatedly between these giants, trying to keep his throne intact. To secure that fragile position, Vlad and his younger brother Radu were sent as hostages to the Ottoman court while still boys. They were not prisoners in chains, but they were not free. Their lives were bargaining chips. Any betrayal by their father would mean their deaths. In the Ottoman court, Vlad received an elite education. He learned languages, military tactics, logic, and warfare. He also learned something else. He learned how absolute power functioned. Executions were public. Punishments were ceremonial. Fear was not hidden. It was displayed. Authority was theatrical. And discipline was enforced through terror. Radu adapted. Vlad did not. Sources indicate that Vlad developed a deep hatred for his captors and a fierce obsession with control. He was beaten, humiliated, and constantly reminded that his life belonged to another ruler's will. These years shaped his psychology. He came to believe that mercy was weakness and that terror was stability. When Vlad finally returned to Wallachia as a young man, he did not return to a safe throne waiting for him. His father had been assassinated. His older brother had been blinded with hot irons and buried alive by political rivals. His family had been erased by betrayal. From that moment forward, Vlad governed as a man who believed that the only barrier between order and chaos was terror executed without hesitation. His first reign in Wallachia was brief and ended in exile. His enemies were too many. His army was too weak, but Vlad did not forget. He waited, he learned, he planned. In 1456, supported by Hungarian military backing, he reclaimed the Wallachian throne. This time he did not rule as a fragile prince. He ruled as a force of extermination. Wallachia at that time was a land of deep corruption. Boyars, the noble class, assassinated rulers regularly. Loyalty lasted only as long as coin. Merchants cheated peasants. Bandits controlled roads, and foreign powers treated the state as a disposable buffer zone. Vlad resolved to destroy this system entirely. Within months, the purges began. Boyars were invited to feasts, then arrested, tortured, and impaled in public squares. Thieves were burned, traders who cheated were skinned, villagers who hid criminals were executed alongside them. Forests of stakes rose at the edges of towns as permanent warnings. Vlad did not negotiate loyalty. He manufactured it through terror. Chroniclers recorded that gold coins were left in the streets and no one dared touch them. Crime vanished, not because it was forgiven, but because it became synonymous with slow public death. To the outside world, this brutality seemed monstrous. To Vlad, it was statecraft, but his cruelty was not random. Every act of violence served a symbolic purpose. Impalement was not chosen for efficiency. It was chosen for spectacle. Victims sometimes took days to die. Their suffering terrified those who watched. The message was unmistakable. Resistance would be punished not just with death, but with prolonged nightmare. By the early 1460s, Vlad had transformed Wallachia into a locked fortress of fear. And then the greatest threat arrived at his border. The Ottoman Empire, under Mehmed II, demanded tribute and obedience. Vlad refused. More than that, he launched a preemptive campaign south of the Danube. Wallachian forces crossed into Ottoman territory and murdered tens of thousands in night raids. Villages burned. Soldiers were impaled in rows. The frontier became a landscape of corpses. This was not conventional warfare. It was psychological annihilation. Vlad wanted the Ottomans to fear entering his land before they ever crossed its border. In retaliation, Mehmed II assembled one of the largest invasion forces Wallachia had ever faced, estimated between 60 and 90,000 soldiers. Vlad could muster barely a fraction of that number. Militarily, he was doomed, so he chose terror instead of triumph. As the Ottoman army advanced, Vlad ordered the countryside stripped bare. Wells were poisoned, crops burned, villages evacuated. The enemy would find no food. No shelter, no comfort, only emptiness and death. Then he struck at night. Small Wallachian units dressed in Ottoman uniforms infiltrated camps. They stabbed sleeping soldiers, slit throats, set fires. Confusion exploded through the darkness. At one point, Vlad nearly reached Mehmed's personal tent during a daring night assault aimed at assassinating the Sultan himself. He failed to kill Mehmed, but he succeeded in infecting the Ottoman army with fear. Then came the final horror. As Mehmed's forces pushed toward Targovite, they emerged from the forests into the field of impaled bodies that would echo through history. Tens of thousands of victims stood frozen in a vast ring of death. Some still twitched in agony, others had rotted where they stood. The battlefield itself had become a weapon. This is where we began, the forest of the dead, the moment when terror defeated numbers. Mehmed II ultimately withdrew. Not because his army was destroyed, but because morale collapsed. His soldiers believed the land was cursed, that its ruler was not human, that victory would bring madness rather than glory. Vlad had turned fear into strategy, and strategy into legend. But terror invites response, and the powers surrounding Wallachia would not allow such a ruler to exist without consequences. After the retreat of the Ottoman Empire in 1462, Vlad's victory should have secured his throne. He had achieved what few believed possible. He forced back the armies of Mehmed II not through superior numbers, but through a campaign of terror so complete it shattered morale itself. Yet the very methods that saved his land also isolated him politically. Terror frightened enemies, but it unsettled allies. At this time, Wallachia existed in a fragile triangle of power between the Ottomans, the Hungarian crown, and the shifting loyalties of the local boyar class. Vlad depended heavily on support from Matthias Corvinus, the young and ambitious king of Hungary. Corvinus presented himself as a defender of Christian Europe against Ottoman expansion. Vlad saw him as a necessary partner for survival. But politics cared little for shared enemies. It cared only for advantage. When Mehmed withdrew, he did not abandon the struggle for Wallachia. Instead, he installed Vlad's younger brother Radu as a rival claimant to the throne. Unlike Vlad, Radu had fully embraced Ottoman culture during his hostage years. He was charming, diplomatic, and obedient to the empire. Many Wallachian nobles, exhausted by terror, began to view Radu as the safer choice. Civil war followed. Vlad's support eroded rapidly. His army, once feared, shrank as boyars defected. His reputation, once a weapon, became a liability. Corvinus, watching carefully from Hungary, saw an opportunity to rid himself of a dangerous ally whose brutality now threatened diplomatic relations with the Ottomans. And then came the betrayal. In late 1462, Vlad traveled to Transylvania seeking military assistance from Hungary to retake his collapsing rule. Instead of reinforcements, he was arrested on the orders of King Matthias Corvinus. The justification was based on letters presented to the Hungarian court, allegedly written by Vlad to Mehmed II, offering submission to the Ottomans in exchange for protection. Modern historians widely agree these letters were forged. The political motive was obvious. Corvinus needed to maintain trade and stability with the Ottomans while presenting himself to Europe as their opponent. Vlad, with his uncontrollable warfare and grotesque reputation, endangered that balance. By removing him, Corvinus gained favor with both sides. Vlad was thrown into imprisonment. For the next 12 years, the man who had ruled through terror lived as a political captive within the territories of Hungary. His conditions fluctuated between harsh confinement and limited noble freedom depending on shifting political winds. But for the first time in his adult life, his power was stripped completely. The forests of stakes vanished. His executioners were gone. The terror machine fell silent. Yet even in captivity, Vlad's legend grew. Across German-speaking Europe, pamphlets began circulating with lurid illustrations of impalements, torture, and grotesque feasts among the dead. These woodcuts, some of the earliest examples of mass propaganda, portrayed Vlad as a demon in human form. They exaggerated his cruelty, sometimes inventing acts beyond any reliable record, but they were built on a foundation of undeniable violence. These publications served multiple purposes. They entertained, they horrified, and they justified his imprisonment to the wider Christian world. If Vlad appeared less as a ruler and more as a mad butcher, his political removal seemed righteous. Meanwhile, in Eastern Europe, a very different narrative developed. In Romanian oral tradition, Vlad survived as a harsh but just ruler who crushed corruption, enforced law, and defended the land against foreign domination. To the West he was a monster. To his people he was a necessary terror. This duality would shape his image for centuries. While Vlad remained a prisoner, his brother Radu ruled Wallachia as an Ottoman client. The principality became a buffer state fully aligned with Turkish interests. The once feared frontier now served the empire's expansion quietly, but history had not finished with Vlad yet. By the mid-1470s, the political landscape shifted again. Ottoman pressure intensified, Hungarian interests realigned. Out of necessity rather than forgiveness, Matthias Corvinus released Vlad from captivity. The former impaler, now older and physically altered by years of confinement, was restored as a military asset. In 1476, with Hungarian and Moldavian backing, Vlad reclaimed the Wallachian throne for a third time. It would be his last. The terror campaigns resumed immediately, though on a smaller scale. Execution returned to the public square. But time had changed the balance of power. Vlad no longer commanded the psychological dominance he once wielded. His enemies had learned how to endure fear. His allies trusted him only out of desperation. Within months of his return, Ottoman forces regrouped and invaded once more. This time there was no retreat before forests of stakes. The political stage had closed. Vlad was killed in battle near the end of 1476. His exact death remains disputed. Some accounts say he fell fighting Ottoman troops. Others claim he was betrayed and assassinated by his own soldiers who mistook him for an enemy. His severed head was sent to Constantinople and displayed to Mehmed II as confirmation that the nightmare was finally over. His body was buried in uncertainty. Even today, historians debate the true location of his grave. But death did not silence Vlad. It transformed him. In the centuries that followed, his reputation drifted from history into mythology. His very name, Dracula, derived from his father's title, Dracul, meaning dragon, became associated not with chivalric orders, but with blood, death, and supernatural horror. In 1897, when the Irish author Bram Stoker published the novel Dracula, he borrowed Vlad's name and fragments of his reputation. The fictional vampire count shared almost nothing with the real Wallachian ruler beyond an infamous title and a homeland in Transylvania. Yet the merger of legend and literature sealed Vlad's fate in the global imagination forever. The historical royal became a creature of the night, yet separating myth from man reveals something more unsettling than fiction. Vlad did not drink blood. He did not transform into shadows. He did not hunt immortality. He ruled through cruelty because he believed cruelty worked, and for a time it did. His terror was not madness. It was calculated state policy, and that is what makes his story so disturbing. He proved that fear could build order, that horror could enforce law, that a ruler could substitute loyalty with dread and still govern effectively, at least for a while. His brutality transformed Wallachia from a corrupt battleground into one of the most disciplined states in Eastern Europe, however briefly. But fear alone could not build lasting political alliances. It could not prevent betrayal. It could not stop propaganda. It could not preserve a throne once external forces aligned against it. By the time the name Vlad Dracula echoed across Europe, it no longer described a single man. It described a method, a philosophy of power built not on loyalty, wealth, or diplomacy, but on the deliberate cultivation of fear. To understand why his terror shook even the most hardened medieval powers, it is necessary to examine how his violence functioned as a structured system rather than random cruelty. In the 15th century, executions were common across Europe. Public hangings, beheadings, and burnings were routine instruments of law. What separated Vlad from other rulers was not simply that he executed people, but that he transformed execution into a prolonged spectacle of domination. Impalement was not chosen because it was the most efficient way to kill. It was chosen because it was the most visible, the most humiliating, and the most psychologically devastating. Victims were placed on stakes sharpened just enough to pierce flesh without immediately severing vital organs. The stake was driven through the body in such a way that death could take hours, sometimes days. The suffering was slow and unmistakable. The body remained upright long after death, turning the executed into living monuments of warning. Rows of victims could be seen from miles away. Travelers approaching Wallachian towns encountered these forests of the dead before they ever saw city walls. This was not simply punishment. It was communication. Vlad understood that most human behavior is governed not by laws written on parchment, but by consequences witnessed with the senses. Fear, when made visible, reshapes entire populations. The threat no longer needs to be repeated. Once witnessed, terror governs silently. Peasants obeyed not because they loved him, but because the alternative was unbearable. Nobles complied not because they trusted him, but because they had seen their social equals turned into objects of prolonged agony. Merchants honored contracts not because of ethics, but because deception had become a slow death sentence. For a time, it worked. Wallachia during Vlad's rule experienced an unprecedented collapse in criminal activity. Contemporary sources noted that travelers could leave purses of gold in the open without fear of theft. The price of this order was blood, but the result was stability in a region otherwise dominated by lawlessness and political assassination. His terror extended beyond domestic governance and into battlefield strategy. When the Ottoman Empire encountered Vlad's methods, they faced psychological warfare centuries ahead of formal military theory. The night attack of 1462 remains one of the most studied examples. Rather than meeting the Ottoman army in conventional formation, Vlad released small units disguised as Ottoman soldiers into the enemy camp after midnight. The objective was not territorial gain but confusion. Fires erupted in multiple directions. Sleep became death. Trust evaporated between comrades. Even when the Ottomans regained formation, exhaustion and paranoia had already crippled morale. This use of deception paired with terror took battlefield fear beyond fear of death and into fear of everywhere. Soldiers could no longer tell where safety ended and danger began. That was Vlad's true innovation. Then came the field of impaled bodies at Targovite, not staged merely for cruelty, but to collapse enemy will before combat even began. Witnesses wrote of Ottoman troops vomiting at the sight. Psychological collapse preceded physical defeat. Terror had become architecture, yet medieval Europe struggled to process what it was witnessing. In the West, particularly in German-speaking regions, Vlad's actions were absorbed into a moral framework that demanded monstrous explanation. Printing presses were newly spreading. Wood-cut pamphlets became Europe's first mass-distributed horror literature. One of the most famous depicted Vlad dining calmly among the dying, while blood soaked the ground around him. Another showed children impaled beside their parents. These images traveled farther than armies. They entered cities Vlad had never seen, to distant populations. He was not a border prince in Eastern Europe. He was terror embodied, but exaggeration merged easily with fact because the foundation was already extreme. What is often overlooked is that Vlad's violence was consistent. He did not primarily target one class. Nobles, criminals, refugees, merchants, foreign soldiers, political rivals, and peasants all fell under the same methods. This uniformity strengthened the system. No one could assume immunity. In earlier medieval states, aristocrats often escaped punishment due to rank. Vlad attacked this imbalance deliberately. By executing respected nobles publicly, he severed the myth that status provided safety. In doing so, he reshaped the social hierarchy not through law, but through terror equality. This terrified the boyars more than any enemy invasion ever could. Foreign observers were divided. Some Catholic chroniclers portrayed Vlad as a necessary demon sent to defend Christendom. Others described him as worse than the Ottomans he fought. This moral confusion reflected a deeper conflict within European political philosophy. Could a ruler commit unlimited violence for the sake of order and still be legitimate? Vlad's reign forced that question into open debate. The human cost was staggering. While exact numbers remain impossible to verify, estimates of those executed during his life range into the tens of thousands. Impalement, boiling, flaying, and exposure were all recorded. Entire villages could disappear in a matter of days if accused of aiding enemies or resisting authority. Yet his violence was never without message. Every punishment was designed as an instruction manual for survival. Do not betray, do not steal, do not lie, do not shelter enemies, do not challenge the throne. Follow these rules, and even under terror, one could live. What changed after his imprisonment was not the cruelty of his rule, but the contamination of his image. During captivity, pamphlets no longer framed him as a disciplined enforcer. They framed him as inhuman. Stories circulated that he dipped bread in the blood of the dying, that he washed his hands in it, that he laughed as victims screamed. Some of these claims are impossible to verify. Others were outright fabrications, but the narrative transformed him from tyrant into mythic villain. This transformation reached its final form in the late 19th century with the publication of Dracula by Bram Stoker. Stoker sought an exotic name for a creature of immortal terror and found it buried in obscure historical texts. The vampire count bore almost no resemblance to the Wallachian ruler beyond blood and Transylvania. Yet the association erased the boundary between documented brutality and supernatural evil in the global imagination. From that point on, Vlad the Impaler and Dracula became permanently entangled. Yet the true horror of Vlad's reign lies not in fantasy. It lies in the reality that fear alone sustained power for years where diplomacy had failed for centuries. He achieved stability without loyalty, order without justice, and obedience without consent. But this model contained its own fatal weakness. Fear inspires compliance, but it also inspires silence, and silence breeds isolation. Vlad ruled alone. His advisors obeyed but did not advise honestly. His nobles complied but plotted endlessly. His allies supported him only as long as he remained useful. When power shifted, he stood surrounded by enemies and no genuine loyalty to protect him. The very terror that secured his throne guaranteed that no one would truly mourn its loss. By the time he returned from imprisonment in 1476, his system no longer terrified the world, it horrified it. His enemies had learned to endure fear because they had learned that terror, even elevated to spectacle, could not stop betrayal, could not stop treaties, could not stop propaganda. Terror is strongest when it is new. Once it becomes familiar, its power decays. Vlad's final campaign demonstrated that erosion. His executions resumed. His authority remained absolute within reach, but beyond his immediate grasp, fear no longer spread outward with the same force. The Ottomans no longer recoiled. They responded with strategy. The Hungarian court no longer feared him. It manipulated him. The boyars no longer trembled. They waited. His system of terror had reached the limit of its historical effectiveness. The final act of Vlad's life unfolded not in a palace or on a throne, but on a cold battlefield where fear could no longer guarantee victory. In late 1476, after briefly reclaiming the throne of Wallachia with Hungarian and Moldavian support, Vlad found himself facing the renewed military machine of the Ottoman Empire. This time, there would be no retreat before forests of stakes. The political balance that once allowed his terror to dominate had shifted permanently. The precise circumstances of Vlad's death remain contested by historians. Most accounts agree that he was killed in battle near Bucharest toward the end of 1476. One version claims he fell while charging Ottoman cavalry. Another suggests he was betrayed by Wallachian nobles who mistook him for a Turkish soldier during combat. A darker tradition claims that his own men, exhausted by years of terror and warfare, turned on him at the moment of crisis. What is certain is that his death was swift and decisive. His severed head was taken to Constantinople and presented to maimed Roman II as proof that the terror of Wallachia had finally ended. The Sultan ordered it displayed publicly. The message was clear. The nightmare that once shook even his armies had been extinguished. The fate of Vlad's body, however, disappeared into uncertainty. Some sources claim he was buried at Snagov Monastery. Others suggest he rests at Komana. Modern archaeological efforts have failed to provide definitive proof. This absence of a confirmed grave only deepened the mythology that would later grow around him. Yet death did not end Vlad's rule over imagination. In many ways it began it. In the decades immediately following his execution, two competing legacies spread across Europe. In the German-speaking world, the printing presses continued to circulate sensational pamphlets portraying him as a monstrous sadist, a ruler who fed on suffering for pleasure. These stories emphasized grotesque scenes of torture, feasts among corpses, and delighted cruelty. While exaggerated, they reinforced the idea that Vlad represented the outer limits of human brutality. In contrast, Romanian oral tradition preserved a different figure. Here, Vlad lived not as a demon, but as a ruthless defender of order. He was remembered as a prince who crushed corruption, punished thieves without mercy, and protected the poor from exploitation. His terror was not denied, but it was justified as necessary. To a people living for generations under foreign domination, he became a symbol of resistance rather than a monster. This divided legacy reflects the deepest contradiction within Vlad himself. He was both destroyer and defender, tyrant and nationalist hero, executioner and lawgiver. Centuries later, this contradiction would be eclipsed by a far more powerful invention. In 1897, the Irish writer Bram Stoker published a novel titled Dracula. Stoker was searching for a name that carried ancient dread. In obscure historical notes, he encountered the name of a Wallachian prince associated with cruelty and bloodshed. That was enough. Vlad's surname became immortal. The fictional Count Dracula shared almost nothing with the historical ruler beyond his homeland in Transylvania and his association with blood. Yet the merging of the two figures proved irresistible to popular culture. Over the next century, Dracula would become one of the most recognized villains on Earth. Films, novels, television series, and folklore transformed Vlad's reputation into that of a supernatural predator. The real terror of Vlad the Impaler was replaced by fictional fangs. Yet in some ways, this transformation numbed the deeper horror. A vampire is fantasy. Vlad was real. His victims were not drained of blood in gothic shadows. They were impaled in daylight before entire cities. The public spectacle, the slow deaths, the deliberate engineering of fear were not metaphors. They were governance. This is what keeps historians returning to his reign. Vlad represents one of the most extreme examples of terror as state policy ever recorded. His violence was not impulsive rage. It was a system, a warning written into bodies, a law carved into flesh. Why did it work, even briefly? Because medieval societies were already familiar with public punishment. Vlad simply removed limits. He demonstrated that when fear becomes absolute, disorder collapses almost instantly. Crime vanished, corruption froze, dissent disappeared into silence. For a short time, Wallachia became one of the most obedient territories in Eastern Europe. But this came with a hidden cost that would ultimately destroy him. Terror eliminates transparency. No one speaks honestly to a ruler who impales. This isolation proved fatal. Vlad ruled without genuine advice, without loyal counsel, without political flexibility. Those who obeyed him did so outwardly while plotting inwardly. When the pressure of Ottoman power returned, his supposed allies did not stand with him. They calculated survival instead. Terror can control behavior, but it cannot create loyalty. This is the central lesson of Vlad's downfall. He mastered the ability to make people obey, but he never learned how to make them believe in him. After his death, Wallachia returned to its role as a buffer state between empires. The fear constructs vanished. The forests of stakes decayed. New rulers adopted softer methods of control, but none would ever leave such an indelible psychological mark. In modern Romania, Vlad remains one of the most complex figures in national memory. He appears in school textbooks as a ruler who fought corruption and foreign domination with uncompromising severity. Statues commemorate him as a defender of sovereignty. At the same time, the tourism industry embraces the Dracula myth, merging history and fantasy into a global attraction centered in Transylvania. Thus Vlad exists today in two forms at once, as a historical prince shaped by brutal medieval geopolitics, and as a fictional monster who stalks the imagination of the modern world. Yet neither version fully captures the truth. The real Vlad was not a vampire. He did not seek immortality. He sought control. He sought order. He sought revenge for betrayal and destruction that marked his childhood. His cruelty was born from captivity, humiliation, political murder, and a ruthless landscape where mercy often meant extinction. He became what the world around him rewarded. This is why his story continues to disturb scholars and audiences alike. Vlad exposes the darkest edge of political power. He demonstrates that terror, when unleashed without restraint, can shape nations, warp cultures, and rewrite boundaries of acceptable rule. He shows that a single ruler, driven by fear and obsession, can alter how entire civilizations think about authority. He also shows the limit of terror. It can build order, but it cannot build peace. It can force silence, but it cannot force loyalty. It can delay collapse, but it cannot prevent it. 5 centuries after his death, the name Vlad the Impaler still carries an echo that few historical figures possess. He is not remembered for his laws, not for his treaties, not for his cities. He is remembered for the method by which he ruled, the stake. In the end, Vlad did not turn terror into an eternal weapon. He turned it into a legend, and legends, unlike kingdoms, never truly die.